speak about the garment industry, simultaneously addressing environmental and social crisis. We all know this industry-specific studies are very important in order to understand the nuances of industry, its related issue. And especially this garment industry, which is part of the textile industry, is very important for not only for the growth aspect, but also the social issues that covers the textile industry, is the workers and all. We have a very diversified textile apparel industry that India had, which contributes to around 5% of GDP and employs around 45 millions. And it's a very diversified, as I said, diversified industry. But also it has so many issues, especially social cost, that it has been highlighted by many. And I am sure that the presentation will give more insight on this social cost related to environment and other issues. So for this presentation, we have Professor Devanathan, and also we have three panelists, eminent panelists. I will give a brief about our distinguished speakers. Professor Devanathan is an eminent economist. He is also a visiting professor at Institute for Human Development in New Delhi. He was also a visiting research fellow at Duke University in the USA. He is also a research director at the GenDev Center for Research and Innovation. His research interests span a wide area of a range of topics, including labor in global production, gender relation, and development issues affecting indigenous people. He has published a number of important works. Some of them are Markets and Indigenous People in Asia, Labor in Global Production Network in India, and Development with Global Value Chains, and very important works as well. Then we have three panelists. First, we will have Professor Padmini Swaminathan. She's a former director of Madras Institute of Development Studies, MIDS, Chennai. There she was also under the RBI chair in regional economics till 2011. Thereafter, she was a professor and chairperson of the School of Livelihood and Development at the Tata Institute of Social Science, Hyderabad. Then she was a visiting professor at the Council for Social Development, Hyderabad. Her work covers in the area of industrial organization, labor, occupational health, and skill development, all from a gender perspective. She's also a board member of several institutes, including ISID, and she has also published a number of important works. Our second panelist is Professor Sumangala Damodaran. She is associated with International Development Economics Associates, IDEAS, and she is also a professor at the Institute for Human Development in New Delhi. She has a PhD from Jawaharlal Nehru University, and earlier she has held a faculty position at the institute, at Lady Sri Ram College for Women, University of Delhi. Apart from her valuable work in the development economics, she is also a well-renowned music artist. So I welcome you. Then we have Dr. Satyaki Roy. He is currently associate professor at ISID. He did his PhD from University of Calcutta. His research area covers a broad spectrum of manufacturing, topics like industrial clusters, spatial concentration of production, labor employment, structural change, etc. He has also published a number of books and articles. So without much ado, let me welcome Professor Devanathan to have this presentation on garment industry. Sir, we have time till 5 o'clock. So maybe half an hour for your presentation, then followed by 3 panelists discussion for 10 minutes each maybe, and then we'll have question and answer to that. So over to you, sir.
Thank you. Thanks to ISID for organizing this webinar, and also for getting an outstanding panel of discussants. I don't know if my presentation justifies this panel, but I look forward to their comments. Can I share the screen?
Yes.
How do I go to full screen?
Yeah, to make it full screen.
Yeah, okay. Is that okay? You can see it?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Okay, this is a joint paper along with Rahul, who is from TISS Mumbai. We both have been working in this area, and we did a study along with some others for the ILO, out of which really this has been developed, which was on what can one do for the garment and textile industry in India, though it didn't quite deal with all of India, but it did deal with some areas, some states of the country. Now, from that, we have developed this paper. Where do we start? Our starting point is on the nature of the crisis we have today. We don't have just one crisis. We have a number of crises simultaneously, and we need to work out a manner in which to deal with the simultaneous crisis. To mention just some of them, one is the inequality. I should not say unequal growth, but inequality in the global economy, where you have the high profit margins in headquarter firms of the global north and low profit margins in manufacturing firms of the global south. So that is the nature of the inequality, global inequality today. Secondly, along with that, you also have precarious and gender unequal employment, particularly in the garment industry with which we are dealing with I am dealing today. Now, along with being unequal and precarious employment, there is also the question of the unsustainable, environmentally unsustainable production in the garment industry. And within this, the greenhouse gas emissions are really concentrated in the global south, because that is where the garment manufacture takes place. So the question is, how do we deal with this? And also, I would put another question: who should bear the costs in that are necessary for dealing with the simultaneous crisis? Now, the first point, which is a point of theory, is that, we economists are used to very much saying, oh, whatever we say is holding everything else constant. Ceteris paribus. That's one of the first things we learn when we begin to study economics, that we remove everything else and reduce it, what is called reductionism to the problem we want to supposedly resolve and hold all else constant. But what we do by that reductionism, we are really externalizing the unintended consequences of our production system. So, but you can externalize it for the firm. You can even externalize it for the economy, like the global north is doing by production of garments in the global south. But you can't externalize it for the globe. The global economy has no externalities. It is all internal, unless, of course, we think we bring the universe in, but we are not in that stage where we can bring the universe into the area of our discussion. So what happens is that these unintended consequences are really internalized in the global economy in the form of climate change as we know it now. So that is the effect of externalization. And we have to hold ourselves as economists also culpable for this, because our economic theory has supported this approach of externalizing that which is not borne by the firm itself, whether it is in the terms of labor, where also there's an externalization, and also in terms of the environmental consequences of production. Now, so therefore, with that overall approach, how do we look at the garment industry? As I already mentioned, that 2/3 of the greenhouse gas emissions from the garment industry are within the area of manufacturing in the global south. Now, this does not include the discharge of untreated effluents into the waterways and soil around the garment manufacturing clusters. As you know, this happens in, say, in Tirupur or Dhaka or everywhere you have these clusters. There's a depletion and contamination of groundwater in the area. The garment industry is also notable for having very low wages. Wages are more or less at the national minimum wage, somewhere, sometime below, sometimes a little above, but more or less around this. And that is true not only in India, but also in really the whole world that manufactures garments. So the low wages are much less than the living wage. It's about 1/3 of the living wage in India, 1/4 in Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, and about 1/2 in China. Now, along with low wages, you also have a widespread prevalence of violence and forced labor. Those of you who have looked at garment industry will know that there is a universal verbal sexual abuse and also high levels of physical abuse. These are not just abuse. These are also, I would say, a method of supervision of work where there are very high quotas, compulsory overtime, and also that these garment workers, particularly the women, are expelled very early from factory work. By the age of 35, very few women are left behind to work in the garment factories. They go out, they may work in workshops or in the informal sector, but not in the main garment factories. So at a time when many of us are really just beginning our professional work, these women are actually being expelled from their professional work, which is that of being workers in the garment factories. Now, what happens with the low monetary costs of production? I mean, finally, what is the result of low wages, violence and forced labor, and the environmental externalities? That the costs of production are brought down at the level of the manufacturing firm. But it is not these manufacturers who capture the profits from the low costs of production. These low monetary costs are really captured by the monopolist or monopsonist brands from the global north. And as we had treated in the book, which I had well, both Rahul and I had co-authored along with Padmini, we call this reverse subsidies. That is, it is a subsidy extracted from the workers, the women, and the environment of the global north, and accruing or being extracted as profits from the global south, being extracted as profits in the global north. So that is what we call a reverse subsidy. Sorry, it's not moving. Okay. So now what are the two areas we want to deal with? One is we want to deal with environmental sustainability, which we have defined as, first of all, a net zero discharge of global greenhouse gases. Secondly, the recycling of water to achieve almost net zero utilization of public water, the treatment of effluents to ensure that there's no toxic discharge, and the elimination of production waste from ending up in landfills, and use of the other waste produced during production. So this is what we call as environmental sustainability. Along with that, we want social sustainability, which is, to put it very briefly, the attainment of decent work conditions for all workers, irrespective of gender. So that relates to wages, social security, working conditions, absence of violence, and so on. So that is the overall, the two concepts that we use. Now, what is the framework within which you analyze it? We use a XY figure, so that you have on the y-axis you have on the x-axis is, on the x-axis is environmental sustainability. So going to the left, it is negative. Going to the right, it is positive. And on the y-axis, you have inclusivity or decent work for labor, which going down to the south is worse, or is poor, is not decent condition, while going northwards, going up, means that the working conditions are better. Where we are right now is in the quadrant A, which has both precarious employment, low margins and profits for the manufacturers or the manufacturing owners, and also polluting production processes. Now, there are two ways, or rather three ways, in which we can move from A. First is we can move towards C, which will require that we improve working conditions and higher margins, but the polluting processes may not be changed. So we'll have a positive with regard to better working conditions, but there'll be no change, or a negative, continuing negative polluting production processes. Or we can have another one, which is you can have cleaner production, but employment can continue to be precarious. What we really want, however, is to go from A to D, where we have both cleaner production, higher margins for manufacturers, and decent labor outcomes. Now, how we actually move from one to the other will really depend upon how the manner in which the bargaining plays out and the way in which we can make one change or the other, or combining both kinds of changes. That is what we would like to propose, that we have to try a manner in which we can combine both a transition to inclusivity and net zero production to move towards a sustainable and inclusive production system. Now, in the net zero production, what we really find is that there's now a lot of push by the brands, and particularly now coming from the EU countries. They are threatening to impose various taxes based upon the pollution or the greenhouse gas emissions. And however, they want the costs of this transition to be borne by the manufacturers. Our main point is that, look, first of all, the profits are earned by the brands in the north. Along with that, more important, most of the production is consumed in the north. So it should be the global north that should have to pay for this transition to net zero production, or at least in proportion to their share of the consumption of the manufactured garments for the global market. Though we do find that there are a number of firms in India, some of which have taken steps in this direction. They've taken steps in a manner hoping that this will give them a bigger share of the market. Arvind Denims, for instance, in Bangalore, has a number of measures which have reduced its consumption of fresh water. Almost 95 to 96% of the water in Arvind is recycled, and only 5% of their water requirement comes from the water from the public sources. Now, you can have we saw a smaller factory, a mid-sized factory in Odisha called Wild Lotus, which actually tried to do some of these things. They had a green building with rainwater harvesting. They used enzyme-based cleaners free of phosphates. The topsoil displaced during construction was reutilized. They had effluent treatment plants and sewage treatment. They recycle water for gardening and flushing toilets. They had a solar energy system and also transformers. Plus, they even used, they transferred the food waste from the canteen to a piggery for use in the raising of pigs. But they did very little with regard to the improvement of working conditions for the worker. A little bit was done, but nothing really significant. So as I said, the question is who should pay for net zero production? Our position is that the contract manufacturers are being pushed to pay for this. They're being forced to bear the costs or it is the manufacturing government that will have to bear it through a subsidy. And the government, the factories of course hope that they will increase their volume. But there is also a transition to inclusivity. Inclusivity meaning, as I said, decent work conditions, particularly living wages for workers. There is some amount of consumer pressure, more in the Scandinavian countries, for ethical production. And you do have some number of firms that have accepted that living wage should be the base for labor costing. Many of them are organized and supported by the Fair Wear Foundation. Now, who pays for this living wage? It is the brands who pay. Either the brands paying living wages have to increase their retail prices. Some of them have a label saying that, look, we are increasing our prices because the extra cost, the extra price is being used to bear the cost of living wages. So please bear with us and please support the living wage by buying these shoes or garments that are more high, that are priced a bit higher. Or there are also some brands, small ones, who do not have the tyranny of quarterly returns. They are not, they're privately owned. They are not public companies that are traded on the share market, who have accepted that profits would be lower as a result of it. I mean, either you have to increase retail prices or you must accept profit. There's no other way in which you can actually pay for living wages, unless you try to push it on the manufacturers, which won't be possible. But of course, none of these mention environmental sustainability or net zero production. So therefore, what we want is both of them, decent work plus net zero production. There's no brand of this type, though there is some, which you find some movement towards inclusiveness and sustainability. There's a brand called Patagonia, which is a US brand, which makes outdoor wear, and their prices and their margins are actually higher than the mass brands. I mean, their margins are like around 50%, more than 50%, as against, say, 40% for a mass brand like M&S or Nike or Adidas. But Patagonia has a peculiar structure. 98, it is a privately owned company. It is not, its shares are not traded on the market. Out of its shares, 90% are owned by an environmental trust. Only 2% remain with the family that started it, which also has the management rights. So what this means is that while the company is managed by the family that started it, 98% of its profits go to the trust, which are used for various environmental interventions, besides the company's own interventions, whether it is in paying living wages or in reducing the environmental effects of their production system. So I come back to this point, that who should bear the cost of decent work and net zero garment production. Now, yeah, decent work does lead to higher productivity, which can provide a private initiative to move in that direction. Yes, so firms can move in that direction, lead firms particularly, but we do have a high level of global competition. I mean, even if these brands are in a way monopolies or oligopolies, but they also compete with each other. And we have a global surplus labor force on the supplier's side, which therefore pushes employment conditions down in the direction of, as it is, staying at the bottom. It's not a race to the bottom there. We're already at the bottom, but we stay at the bottom. So what do we need to do to improve this? What we do require is that there are now all of these special economic zones. These special economic zones need to be transformed. The government of India is setting up a number of special economic zones for the garment and textile industry. We are saying that they should make SSEs, that Sustainable Special Economic Zones. That is, the facilities in the zone should be such that the production within the zone is sustainable, with zero net emissions, no discharge into of waste into the environment, etc. And along with that, it should be made a condition that those manufacturers or brands that wish to utilize the facilities of these special zones that are net zero facilities, they should also meet the decent work requirements. So we need to combine the two. If you want to have a net zero facility, then please have living wages, equal wages for women and men, etc., as the conditions under which you can carry out this production. Of course, it's not going to be easy to bring about such things, but the point is to be able to at least think of what is a possible way in which we can solve both problems, and then see how we can build a political coalition moving in that direction. Now, there already is an international convention. Many of us may not be aware of this, but there's actually an ILO Maritime Labor Convention, which is one which, unlike other conventions, it sets both labor and environmental conditions, and plus it has the authority to carry out actions. For instance, all ports or all port authorities are allowed to inspect ships that come under the of countries that are signatory to the ILO Maritime Labor Convention, and something like 90 to 95% of shipping in the world is by countries that are part of this convention. They can inspect them for labor conditions and environmental conditions. Now, these labor conditions are not uniform. They are calibrated, they are differentiated by the level of the country that owns the ship. You know, there are many ships that are actually registered in what are known as flags of convenience. They may be registered in Liberia or in some such country, but they're actually owned by maybe a European or an American country. But anyway, depending on where the ships are, they have different wage levels. There is a lower wage level, but they're all higher than what used to be and are more or less corresponding to what we would call living wages. So there's a wage level for the low-income countries. There's a intermediate wage level for emerging economies like India and China, and there's a much higher wage level for the high-income countries. So the Maritime Labor Convention combines both labor and environmental conditions and has calibrated the labor conditions by the level of income of the owning country. Therefore, what we are proposing is that the sustainable special economic zones should be of a similar type. They should have net zero production facilities. They should have affordable owned or rental accommodation for workers around the cluster. There should, of course, be education and medical facilities, public transport facilities, and a commitment to set living and equal wages for women and men, along with elimination of gender-based violence and a platform for social dialogue. Now, you know, for those of us who are older, we know the old public sector zones that were set up. And they more or less are like what we are proposing over here. Of course, they didn't have the environmental requirements. Those can well be added, but they all provided accommodation for workers. They all provided for medical and education facilities, transport, etc. What we're saying is that this should be made a feature of the new types of economic zones that we need to set up, along with the bringing in the environmental, the net zero facilities that we are proposing. Of course, the cost of this net zero will all be reduced by the provision at a large scale. Individual firms cannot have net zero very easily, or even a net zero discharge into the employment. You need a large scale to be able to treat effluents, etc. So that is required on a large scale as a cluster. Now, the use of these new technologies for net zero production can be promoted by the WTO if it were able to declare that critical technology for climate change should be subject to compulsory licensing. Compulsory licensing with a fee paid for the owner which may be a multiple of the cost of production of this knowledge, but will not establish a monopoly. The point is to get rid of the monopoly in the critical technology. This happened during global public emergency of the HIV/AIDS, but not in the COVID period. We do require this type of change in the intellectual property system, both with regard to critical technology for dealing with climate change and also critical technology for the public health emergencies. As the WHO tells us, the COVID is not going to be the last global health pandemic. We are going to have some more. And as I said in the beginning, the cost of this net zero technology should be globally distributed on the basis of the share of globalized GVC production. We're talking of garments. So as I mentioned, that depending on the share of the garment industry, global garment industry, the traded garment production that is being consumed in the global north, countries of the global north should be required to bear the cost of the net zero technology, and of course also the cost of moving to decent work in the same proportion. Now, who will pay? That is for the government of the consuming countries to decide whether it will be a tax on the brands or will be paid out of the exchequer, which means the overall taxpayers in the global north pay for it. And of course, as I mentioned, that this net zero production should be combined with the implementation of decent work conditions. Now, under what conditions is this more likely? Corporations that are not publicly traded, that is, who are not subject to the tyranny of the financial market and of short-term returns, as it is said, who are cooperatives, community-owned, or even private, are more likely to be part of a net zero and decent work production system. So we could also promote a change in the manner in which capital is owned. Now, at this point, of course, I'm not suggesting the abolition of capital, but to change the nature in which corporations exist from being publicly traded and therefore subject to the tyrannies of financialization and short-term returns, but to be alternative types of ownership of these corporations. Well, I think that ends what I have to say. Thank you. I should get out of this screen sharing.
Thanks a lot, sir.
Thank you.
Very detailed presentation of the issues, challenges and issues related to the garment industrial development. So let us move to the panelists now. I invite Professor Padmini Swaminathan to have the floor and let us see.
Yeah.
Floor is yours, ma'am.
Yeah. Thank you, sir. Thank ISID and Satyaki Roy and Rajesh for this opportunity to be here. Thank you also, Dave, for a very comprehensive presentation. What I have to say, Dave, is I'm going to start from the framework which you put up, the theoretical framework that you put up, because that set me thinking. And that is, how do you go from A to B? And along with that, the question that I asked myself, which I'm now opening out to the panelists, how do you make anybody pay? So, for example, how do you make the North pay? So you said somebody has to pay, somebody has to bear the cost. It could be the North, but how do you make the North pay? And it is in that context that I felt that, and I'm just moving out of the garment also, because garment is one cluster, and there are so many clusters that are strewn across the country, our own country, and which have been studied by several people here. All the panelists here have studied also those particular clusters, different kinds of clusters. And we have similar problems, and we also have unique problems in many of these particular clusters. But the fact of payment of wages, decent wages, environmental sustainability, these are very common issues to most of these particular clusters. So not just the government, but also too. And you're right that we will have to take, and as also Rajesh said right at the beginning, we will have to take sector by sector and work out what exactly that particular sector requires. So, but that will take a long time, but I'm just going to put out what I felt was what could be some kind of larger issues that we may have to discuss. One of the things that struck me, since I've also worked on the cashew nut, on the leather, on Tirupur, and I've read a couple of pieces on the plantation sector. One of the things that struck me was this term called what we call as state capacity. What is the capacity of our states to actually get things done? And I'm saying this particular issue of state capacity because I used to do a course in this Hyderabad and at this thing also, another institute of this. Where I actually saw, first time in my life in having done industrial organization in Bombay University, I also realized that we were not exposed to the East Asian economy. So I actually sat and worked on the East Asian economies to find out what exactly, how did they actually manage the state capacity to get things done. So to cut the long story short, you also have a carrot and stick policy to get things done, apart from organizing the way in which the bureaucracy does and all of that. So what I'm trying to also point out is that, so unless you have high, and that is a scarce thing in our, even though the private sector in our country may think there's too much of state interference, actually we have a crucial lack of administrative capacity, effective administrative capacity in our states. So that is a crucial aspect that I find that also is working in all the clusters that I have studied and of which I have also read. One of the another issue that I wanted to also, because that brings me to the issue of do we have an industrial policy that actually brings in these particular issues together? And I think one of the questions, that crucial question that was raised, was in a book that was edited by R. Nagaraj, bringing together many of these studies, in which Satyaki Roy also has one on the garment industry in West Bengal. And that's a very interesting study, which also has, and I'm sure Satyaki will be saying something about that here, so I don't want to preempt whatever he has to say. But that also brings out very well some of the issues that you are implicitly saying, but may not have said it explicitly. And one of the crucial research questions that that was at the nub of that particular book was, do we have an industrial policy that brings together several of these? And why do I say that we do we have an industrial policy? Because cluster by cluster, when you look at all the studies there, you are trying to find out, one actually had to find out, why is it something worked, the policy, similar policies that were instituted across the country, why did it work in some places? Why is it that it did not work? What was the unique thing in that particular this thing? And the same industry, for example, you had an Aligarh lock industry, you also had a Dindigul lock industry, but something, the Dindigul lock industry works, the Aligarh does not work. So what is it that makes Dindigul work, and what is it that does not make Aligarh actually work? One of the things that one also found out was the social embeddedness that is characteristic of each of these particular clusters. So the second aspect that I'm talking about is, do we have some kind of a notion of an industrial policy that brings together and tries to understand what is it at the bottom of each of these particular clusters, and what is it that will work and will not work, and then is able to negotiate with the buyers of our products and this thing. My third point that I wanted to quickly point out is about the women workers and the low wages and those issues that you actually spoke about, which of course is quite common. But again, what you also find is what is unique in each of these particular clusters. And I just want to point out the kind of issues that you have pointed out, which is characteristic of the garment industry, is also very much characteristic of the cashew nut industry that we actually studied about. And this is in spite of the fact that the left front government in Kerala had banned home processing of cashew nut, but they could not completely distinguish because even after the ban, a large number of this processing was done at home, and it was being done by Muslim women in a particular district. and there was some kind of paralysis of not wanting to touch that particular thing. So even though officially there was a ban on home processing, and cashew nut processing was to be done in the factory on wages and everything was stipulated by this thing, you still had more and more of work being changed from factory work into home-based work. And a lot of that processing was actually happening. So once again, we come back to what is it that did not prevent us from actually implementing what we had actually instituted. That's about the cashew nut thing. The other thing that I wanted to point out about a recent thesis which I had to examine, and of course this thing is already over, Viva is already over, so I can talk about it, is that about the plantation industry. Now, what is very interesting about the plantation, because you spoke about people being expelled from home, and women are the first people to be expelled from work and all of that. There's complete contrast in the plantation sector where the entire pluckers are all women and they are all permanent workers. And the permanent workers in the plantation, women workers, are the most exploited. They get the lowest pay. Why are they permanent? They have on average 17 years of experience. So you're not talking of short experience of 6 months or 8 months or 1 year or whatever it is. You're talking of on an average 17 years of experience. And they're at the bottom of this whole thing, precisely because they have been given line houses or those row houses in the plantation sector. They are there as permanent workers, and they are there for generations. So just to hold on to that house, they the next generation of workers, their own children or daughters-in-laws or whatever, become pluckers in the tea industry. The last thing that I want to point out about this entire state, which also relates to the state capacity, is that many of them are migrant workers. So even in Tirupur, you have a large number of migrant workers. In many of these industries, you have migrant workers. And in the plantation sector, this migration has gone on for generations. And yet the Munnar thesis that I examined is talking about for several generations, these people are migrant. We still call them migrant. So how long does it take for a migrant within our own country to become permanent worker, to be recognized as a this thing of that particular thing? So because they are migrant workers, they speak Tamil, they don't get the benefit of many facilities that the Kerala government actually gives. And the most important part of that kind of facility that is not given is the land that they don't get to even be able to buy a house or whatever it is. So once again, one is coming back to that if you want to actually, one thing is to how to make the not pay for many of the things that we are talking about, but within our own country, among our own workers, how do we make some things actually work is something that I'm actually drawing out from because sustainability is not just in terms of how we make the not pay or the buyers pay. It is also how we have an industrial policy, coherent industrial policy, how we have some of these measures that actually work within our own country. So I'll stop there and come back if there are more time to talk about it. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you for your very insightful observation, not only for garment but other sectors as well. So I now invite Professor Sumangala Damodaran to have her views. So over to you, ma'am. You are not, you are muted.
You have to unmute Sumangala.
Sumangala, you're mute.
Yeah, now it's okay. Can you hear me? Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for this opportunity to comment on a very interesting presentation. I'm ISID is not a outside place for me. I started my academic career in ISID. So thanks to Shastri for asking me to speak. And of course, it's a pleasure to be commenting on Dave's work. We've also worked together for a long time, and it's a pleasure to actually see it going in specific directions. So I don't want to say anything specifically about the garment industry because I'm not really the expert on the garment industry. I know a bit about garments, but then with Padmini and Shashwati here, I don't think we really need comments from me in terms of specificity of garments. I thought I'll just and in any case, Padmini has already spoken about a lot about the specifics in her comments. What I thought is that I'll raise some larger issues, and which are issues which really concern me and have concerned me over several decades now. When one actually studies these export-oriented industry and industrial organization as well as labor conditions, and of course now we are discussing the case of sustainability, environmental protection and sustainability. So let me start with this whole thing of ceteris paribus. Now, ceteris paribus is a condition only in neoclassical economics. It's not only paradigms that grew from neoclassical economics that have been harmful to the environment. So even if we didn't actually follow, a framework which came from partial equilibrium analysis, which is where ceteris paribus matters, even socialist models have not been very good for the environment. So what I'm trying to say is that, yes, of course, ceteris paribus is a peculiar kind of a construction that a particular variety of economics came up with in order to somehow, demonstrate that economics was a science. And therefore, one could actually draw, very easy cause-effect relationships if one were to, maintain what might be the closest to laboratory conditions, which is to have, control over all other variables and so on. So, this is just a larger theoretical point that I'm making, that all systems have not been kind to the planet, and I think that is one thing that whether we are talking about the triple crisis or whether we are talking about what we've seen in the world with the outbreak of COVID and various other major climate and health disasters, that humanity has not been very good when it comes to treating the environment kindly. So, what then would be the theoretical framework that we would need? It would need an overhauling of all kinds of theoretical frameworks, I think, and therefore, if we are looking at work on climate and work on environment and sustainability and so on, it is coming from as many directions as there are in the theoretical world of economics, and there are also very, very major differences between them. So this is just a minor point because they began with this idea of ceteris paribus and how that needs to be discarded. Now, this discussion that we are having today around what could be, who can pay when there are these asymmetries between the North and the South, again, has been something that has been around for a very long time. And the question that was being asked in the 70s and the 80s around international standards continues to be relevant. Although I'm not a person who believes anymore that there should not be international standards, because even if it is international pressure that puts pressure on companies to conform to particular kinds of ethical standards, that's better than not having any ethical standards at all. But that does not take away from the larger issue that used to be raised in the 70s and the 80s, which is that international labor standards also become non-tariff barriers. And in developing countries, that is a very serious problem. And it's often what would happen is that the conditions would move from the tradable sector into the non-tradable sector. So when you have an overall atmosphere where there is no pressure to conform to standards at all, in fact, their state policy is actually promoting moving away from minimum standards, like in labor standards, I don't think we should lose sight of that discussion as well. Which is, as I said, I'm not saying, because I do believe that even those kinds of pressures which come from international organizations or the Scandinavian countries or conscious consumers are valuable for whatever change they push through. But I think this is one point that I wanted to bring back into the discussion. And then what happens to domestic production also? Like again, something like garments, where it is a very major export sector, but we also have such a huge domestic market in garments, and the leakage between the export sector and the domestic sector is quite large. So what then about any of these standards for domestic production? So are we only talking about these standards being applicable for internationalized production? Another term that I'm not actually very comfortable with is inclusivity. Because, I mean, of course, there is a large critical literature on the concept of social exclusion and how social exclusion. I don't want to go into that critique, but what do we mean by inclusivity? Is giving minimum wages inclusive? Is just barely allowing people to exist and just conforming to some absolute bare minimum standards inclusive? That's I think a fundamental question that I have. Or because when we talk about inclusion, I would have assumed that we are talking actually about a gross reduction of inequality, a very significant reduction of inequality. And if we even want to talk about it in terms of profits and so on, it would be that when profits go up, the profits are shared substantially with the working class. So that's the thing about just maintaining decent work conditions qualify as inclusion. And I think that is falling into the trap of actually defining inclusion and exclusion in World Bank terms, which is just to say that as long as the poor are not dying, as long as the poor are reasonably happy and are not rebelling, it is an inclusive economy. So I think, it's a larger critique of the term inclusion. However, I think, in terms of the specific, measures that are being suggested in the paper, they are fantastic. And I agree that, this could be a way forward. I'm just not very comfortable with what could be a cosmetic change being called a substantial change and being called something like inclusion. And the last point that I want to make is that what does it even mean for us to suggest these kinds of changes in an overall ethos of labor market reform? With the kind of deregulation that India has seen, your slide itself showed it, that there are all these specific measures that are suggested for, zero, I'm forgetting the term. What was the term that you were using, which is basically to say that their mental effects have to be zero, right? The negative effects have to be zero. So there is so much detail that there is when it comes to the policy prescriptions that are there for environmental sustainability. When it comes to labor, and you pointed this out, and this happens again and again and again. So when it comes to labor, it is okay. People will be given vitamins. People will be given, fresh facilities. Women might be provided fresh facilities, and so on and so forth. There is no word about actually not only maintaining labor standards, actually upgrading labor standards. So in that kind of an environment, it is after a point, I think, futile. And if one is actually talking about a political project of ensuring greater dignity for labor, I think, without a fundamental challenge that has to come from the ILO or from UN institutions or from various other institutions in terms of the pressure on a country like India to not implement those labor market reforms, beyond the point, we might actually see some measures for environmental sustainability, but I don't see any way in which the conditions of employment are going to improve it in any substantive way. At best, there might be some pressure for some companies to adopt some norms, and this is what we've all found in our own research, right? That things don't really get upgraded unless it is considered part of the essential policy package, that you just cannot function if you do not have decent work. So these are some of the larger issues that I wanted to raise. And yeah, thank you for the opportunity again.
Thank you, Professor Sumangala, for your insights. So now we come to our last panelist, Dr. Satyaki Roy, please.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Rijesh. And thanks to Professor Devanathan and Professor Padmini and Professor Sumangala for making them available for this excellent discussion. But I would say that, first of all, regarding this presentation, we have all heard probably Professor Devanathan several times, and it is always a pleasure to listen from him for his insightful presentations, where, of course, garment industry is the premise on the basis of which this paper is being proposed. But this is only an entry point. It is the context on the basis of which probably Professor Devanathan is putting forward larger issues, which is relevant for other industries which are integrated into the global production network. I would say that, to me, I would agree with what both the other panelists have already suggested or hinted upon. That, to me, it sounds little a kind of a normative proposal, that what should be the scenario on the basis of which there can be a political project can be drawn upon. And for that, it is a good proposal in the sense, or a set of ideas which would help us to bring out what are the major issues on the basis of which some political mobilization can be made. But if we see that why this is happening, and why, even if these would sound very good for the betterment of industry, to make it inclusive and sustainable, why actually it is not happening in most of the garment industries. Now, if we see that there has been a relocation of production in the developing countries in the past 3-4 decades, and now around 83% of the manufacturing employment is actually located in the global south. So they are also polluters, they are also the most labor-intensive activities are now organized in the global south. And the recent investment data report also suggests that 70% of the FDI inflows are now located towards the global south. So it is becoming a center of production, particularly for labor-intensive activities. And of course, it is we should think of garment industry, because this is one of the industries where employment can be created for unskilled labor as well. Because most of the FDI that is coming to developing countries are largely not so labor intensive in the standards of the global south, but of course they're labor intensive according to this global north, like machinery, like chemicals, like electrical equipments, electronics, and so on. But in garments, this employment can be created. That is one good thing. But why they're moving there? And there are a lot of literature which basically suggests that this movement is because of two reasons. One is the labor arbitrage, where there is a huge differential in wages, and that is the attraction. The second is, of course, the asymmetric relationship which still exists. Your presentation itself suggests that the profit which is being created in India, in Bangladesh, or in developing countries, a large part is being appropriated or captured by the multinational companies who have this monopsonic or structure, and they get advantage of capturing the profit or the surplus which is being generated in the global south. Now, if this is the reason why they are coming, and if this is the case that even an employer or an entrepreneur can get a higher share of the surplus in the form of rent, only when that an employer can protect a kind of a resource which he or she or that particular company has a privileged access, then only they can protect the rent. In the sense, what I'm saying that Kaplinsky argued in the context of global production network that it is not only profit, it is because you can create certain resources, organizations, technologies, and protect a property right on that, on the basis of which we derive rent. Now, if this is the case, what is the possibility that the entrepreneurs who are located in the global south and where there is no protection for the labor, in the sense that the knowledge is protected in the global north through patents, through royalties, through copyrights, and so on. But those who are located in the bottom of the smile curve, for them, the only resource which is abundant is labor, and that is completely unprotected because global capital gets easy access to both labor and the natural resources that exist in the global south. And I would say that this is what actually Farshad Arigi, he talked about accumulation by displacement, where he says that basically this accumulation today happens both by under the production of labor and nature. And this is actually happening, which comes out from a presentation, that it is not only cheap labor, but also under the production of nature is partly contributing to the process of accumulation that is happening in today's world. Now, we know all this literature has been discussed widely. It is coming from the tradition of unequal exchange. People also talk about how there is a declining barter terms of trade of light manufacturing today vis-a-vis sophisticated manufacturing goods produced in the developed north. And also there are also issues of pain effect and all, which actually reduces the share of the global south in the total value added. Now the question is that if we want to increase not only the rights or the wages of the workers, protect our environment, but also to protect the share of profit of the entrepreneurs who are located in the global south, then we have to find out those moments where through which we can actually derive rent. Now, I would like to know that in case of garment industries, if we want to have a bargaining power with the global north, what are the moments of intervention that a particular capitalist or a particular company located in the global south has, through which we can increase in the share of profit, and then also we can talk about the workers' wages and their rights. Otherwise, we can think of that this should be an ideal situation, but actually how it will happen, we do not know. I agree with what Professor Sumangola has mentioned, that if it is true that some global standards, ethical norms, and all these play an important role to impose certain conditions to the labor and working conditions to the companies in the global south, but it can also be used as non-tariff barriers, which had earlier been done, but I'm not going into that because it has already been discussed. The point is that the way you said that North has to pay, my question simply is that why would not pay? Now, if we see the history of the workers' right or whatever rights that the workers or the people at large got, it is being provided by the state, by the nation states in the history of capitalism when certain contestations happened. So you say that this much of minimum wage has to be paid, this much of social security has to be paid. The state imposes them and then it is being executed. It is not that from any ethical or moral standard, the owners or the employers or the capitalists, they implemented such norms. Now, the question is, in a global framework, when we're talking about these global production networks where these garment industries are located, since there is no global state, and since always we say that ILO can propose, you just mentioned this Maritime Labor Convention, which gives a certain premise on the basis of which certain struggles can be made. But who will implement that? And what if the state or the company doesn't implement that? The point is that ILO has no teeth. We are telling this for quite some time, and we know that it will not have any teeth because this is the premise of accumulation on the basis of which this production network actually functions. So if the labor gets a living wage, if the climate and the environmental conditions are maintained, properly, then it has a cost. And if it has a cost, the advantage of relocating production in the global south actually erodes. Now, how to answer that question, and whether we, in this framework, whether we can implement the kind of prescriptions you made in your presentation would be possible at all. The last point which I want to mention is that I want to refer Giovanni Arrighi, his book, The Long 20th Century. And there he argues about the role of the nation state and how it evolved in different phases, where he links the evolution of the state with the systemic cycles of accumulation over the long history of capitalism. And he says that in the first stage, when it was an Iberian state, it internalized protection. Then in the British state, it was protection and production, both was internalized. The state looked after that. The American state looked after protection, production, and also transaction costs. And he says that the next systemic cycle, if it has to emerge, then it has to also internalize reproduction costs, which includes both labor and nature. And then only capitalism would be sustainable. So the point is, of course, what you prescribe is within this broad framework. But I am not very clear that given the structure or global structure and the asymmetries which all the panelists have mentioned, in this premise, how to actually execute the wish list that you have proposed. I stop here.
Thank you, Dr. Satyaki, for your insightful comments. Now that we have all the presentation and by the panelists as well, now I invite Professor Devanathan to have some reflections, some comments on some observation. Yeah, we have time. We have 15 minutes, so plenty of time. So you can have further discussion on this if you want. Yeah. Sir, you're muted.
Thanks for all the comments, very useful. One or two clarifications. I like the way Satyaki put it. This is a normative proposal for building a political project, right? That's exactly what it is. We need to think of where do we want to go if we are to build any kind of political project. How we go there is the next step. How can we build a political coalition that can bring this about is the next step. But first we need to have an idea of where do we want to go. That's what I tried to propose in this paper. Secondly, a clarification. I was not proposing that minimum wages is inclusive development. In fact, I was very clear that minimum wages is not. And I said that minimum wages, national minimum wages, are about, say, 1/3 of the living wage in India, maybe 1/2 in China, and even 1/4 in Bangladesh and Sri Lanka. So I did propose as a very base for inclusivity or a decent working condition that living wages should be the base on which labor is costed, not a minimum wage. Minimum wage is what we have nowadays. It is just a starvation wage, or it is just barely a subsistence wage. So what we are proposing is way beyond that, whether it's regard to a living wage or gender equality and so on. All of these are a package of what we can call decent work. In fact, unfortunately, the decent work condition don't really put forward very clearly the living wage as it. But I think we need to take that, taking into account that a living wage is what we need. That is the second point. Third, I agree that I was trying to use this as a way of getting at larger issues. So the ceteris paribus is only one point with regard to the manner in which our economic theory needs to be redone. As Sumangala mentioned, it's not only the it's not only what we call capitalism that has not been able to solve the environmental issue, but even socialism has not been very kind to the planet. I remember very strong in the 1970s, as we were coming of age in a sense, I remember a book which I don't know if you all have read. It's called Away with All Pests. This was about a program in Maoist China to get rid of sparrows, etc., because they eat up the grain. Now, obviously, this had a completely non-understanding of the interactions between different parts of the environment. And I don't know what would have happened if we had got rid of all the, they did a similar thing actually in North Korea, because they said, look, animals require feed and we don't want to feed our grain to them. So let us mechanize the entire system of cultivation. So they had an entirely tractorized system. And when the Soviet Union collapsed, and of course, it was based on this zero cost of energy, because they got free energy from the Soviet Union. There's even instead of taking an irrigation canal around a hill, they actually, pumped up the hill and brought it down on the other side, which is so much more using energy, because energy had a zero cost. That is the point. If we put these as having a zero cost, then there's no way we can deal with them and make them part of our economic analysis. This leads me to a bigger issue of the nature of economic theory. We have all grown up with the Robbins definition of economics: allocation of scarce means to competing, means or resources to competing uses, okay? But the point is, we not only use resources, we also make them. When the effluents are discharged from a plant, they change the resource, the environment, into something else. So we did not only use the effluent, we also made the resource, which is a depleted and a polluted environment. So unless we can bring that reflexivity into our economic theory, there is no way we can deal with the manner in which the economy and the environment interact and make each other together, a co-evolution as it is put. So this is a much bigger issue of economic theory. And this only brings me to a point that Einstein has made. You can't solve a problem by using the same theory that you use to create it. So the economic theory that we use to create the climate change and the environmental issue is not the one that's going to solve this problem. We'll have to refashion economic theory. That's a very big issue. But I think we need to, as economists, we need to be aware that this is something we cannot get away from, and see how to bring reflexivity into our, it's not just going from partial to general equilibrium analysis. Even that won't work. We need reflexivity, that we don't only use resources, we also make them or create them. That is I think it's a major point. And I'm glad Sumangla raised this question of the economic theory, which I just alluded to in some way. Now, the question, Satyaki said, how do you, by actually, if you were to bring about such a change, would you not erode the competitive advantage that the South has in manufacturing? No, I don't think it will. Wage rates in the US are so much higher than those in any part of the global South, 30 times as much. And unless the technology changes, at the same sewing machine technology, there is no way the global North can compete with the South. Even if we institute a living wage, it'll double, it'll treble the wage cost, but the increase in the wage cost, and if we even increase the payment for water, etc., it will still make only a maximum a 10% difference in the retail price. It's not going to end the advantage that the South has, which is that historically, we now have a much lower standard of living and therefore much lower wages than in the North. So I don't think these are going to end that. And this is not a form of, a protectionism to say that we should have these standards. What I'm arguing for is actually that the North should have to pay for this change in the standards, both in wages and in the environment. So the question of climate justice, which of course it was Anil Agarwal and Sunita Narayan who first raised the issue of the manner in which the costs of global emissions are to be distributed, and the costs of mitigation of global emissions are to be distributed. And I think that still holds true. We need to bring in the question of climate justice into the discussion on the sustainability. We can't leave it out. So now, the Maritime Labour Convention, I use that as an example. It struck me, I didn't know about this, but a few years ago, I was invited because, I work on global value chains. So the Seafarers Union invited me to their convention. And for the first time, I came to know about the Maritime Labour Convention when I spoke to a friend who has been, Deputy Director General of the ILO, and he said, Jay Rogers, and he said, well, this Maritime Labour Convention is a corner by itself in the ILO, and it has little to do with the rest. But the point is to make that into the whole and not leave it as it is. The Maritime Labour Convention, as I mentioned, is actually implementable. Every port authority has the right to inspect a ship, both on labor standards and on environmental issues. It can hold the ship up, it can allow it, it can impound the ship and not allow it to move if the standards are not complied with. Now, when I spoke to the Seafarers Union, they said this has made a huge difference to the possibility of increasing wages. It has allowed us to unionize because we now have a standard that we can fight for, and we have a right to do that. And this is now, it is implemented all over the world. So similarly, if we could have what I'm proposing, this type of labor standard as part of a government labor convention, which won't be easy, because obviously the employers in the North will oppose it, like they did even on the question of the Maritime Labour Convention. But the point is, if we can build that political coalition, yes, something can happen. And in that building of the coalition, I also mentioned the question of intellectual property rights. This is bringing yet another issue into the discussion, but we need to see what we need to do. I mean, we do have global monopolies, we do have a form of intellectual monopoly capitalism, which operates, one, on the product market by increasing prices, and secondly, operates as global monopoly in the labor and environment market by reducing prices. So we need to be able to tackle the base of the global monopoly, which is really intellectual monopoly capitalism. Now, these are very big issues, but I think we should not keep them out of our discussion. I didn't go into the ways in which this can be discussed, what is the problems in implementation, etc., that were raised, because I don't think that is the type of discussion I was putting forward. I was really putting forward, as Satyaki put it, that is, what is the type of, how can we develop an economic system which will allow the South, as the manufacturer of the world today, to be able to both solve the environmental and the issues, the decent work issues, if I don't use the term inclusivity, the decent work issues, which would give some manner of, an important position for, an improved position for labor in order to be able to solve the dual problems which we now have, where we have to combine the question of exclusion with the question of environmental non-sustainability. So I would, which I think that if we were to move in a direction of from minimum wages to living wages, I think it would have a big impact on inequality, as the wage levels would increase. It would also require, as Satyaki pointed out, an increase in the profits that are earned by the manufacturers or the owners of the manufacturing units in the South. Now, when I remember that trade unionist in Bangalore saying, look, what's the point of trying to organize workers in these small little union units where they get so little that there's no way wages can go up. Therefore, we only concentrate on the big units where they have some power of bargaining, and we know they can pay a little more because they do have a position, whether it is a unit like, particularly they refer to Arvind, because Arvind has a strong position in the market. So the point is, yes, you will have to have a redistribution of power, which is not going to come about easily, but that's the way in which we have to look. How do we rein in the manner in which the global north has been able to bring the whole situation to where we have nearly both issues of, we have serious problems of both sustainability and the exclusion of a large majority of the working population. So I would just like to thank all of the discussants, and also ISID for organizing this, giving me the opportunity to once again place these ideas before you. But I would like you to look upon it as, we have to, as they nowadays say, we have to imagine the future if we have to work for it. That old socialist future is not there, but we have to imagine new futures and something that we can bring about. And let's see how we can do that. And we have to bring in various issues, sustainability, and also the question of intellectual property rights, how to have intellectual property rights that will not create monopolies as we now have. The basic monopolies of the world are intellectual monopolies. I don't know if you noticed, NVIDIA, which makes the chips that are now used in the AI, artificial intelligence, has suddenly grown in a few years' time to be the 5th largest company in the world, all because of its intellectual monopoly on the processing chips that are high-level processing chips that are made. So that global monopoly is part of the system. The global intellectual monopoly is part of this, which we need to look at. Thank you.
Sir, I think we can open now discussion from the floor. If anybody have some questions or some clarification to us, you can ask the speakers if there is any questions. Chat box, I have seen some. So. There is a question by Sandhya Iyer. How do you envision implementation of global standards garment sector, especially across diverse enterprises, MSME, and heterogeneous production frontier when there is greater capitalist uncertainty? What is the role of public subsidy in creating an equitable footing? I think if anybody wants to have some comments, yes.
Sorry, can you read that question again? I can't see it here.
So this is, how do you envision implementation of global standards garment sector, especially across diverse enterprises, MSME?
Okay.
I want to add one question to this. And that is, can you tell us something about, if there is something happening that you can talk about a global minimum wage in a particular sector? Say, for instance, in developing countries, if you want to produce that, you at least have to pay this much of wage. I know some exercises were going on by the trade unions in a global forum to find out, to arrive to some floor wage. Now, whether this is happening, actually it is happening or not, in relation to this question as well. And the other thing, sir, the other point is that, of course, the difference, even if the wages increase, as you suggested, wages should increase and the difference should be remaining. But if I get the advantage to employ a worker at a lower wage, why should I pay a higher wage? So that question still remains.
Yeah, of course, no employer would pay a higher wage than required. But the point is, why do we have national minimum wages? Because we agree that it cannot go below a certain minimum. So why don't we increase that to be a living wage? Now, it cannot be done at one step for the whole country, I agree. But the point is, in the way that public sector units were able to have higher wages, why cannot we say that all export units should also have higher wages because they are part of a global system where the profits are so high. I mean, do you know what the profits of Levi's and M&S, etc. are? They're in, 50%. These are their gross margins. And the gross margins of our manufacturers are 9 to 10%. So should we not have some kind of reordering of these margins? And therefore, where wages comes in, because it would put up the cost of production. So wages would be an important part of actually reducing inequality if we are able to move towards living wages. So I think that's an important part of it.
We come back to the question about, why don't we have this is one question to ask. Why can't we implement a national minimum wage? But again, we come back to the question that from an economics thing, it comes to a political thing. Who is going to implement that particular thing?
I agree.
And how are we going to make that? Because the trade unions have been very ineffective in doing this. And the trade unions are very clear about what they will do and what they will not do. There are many issues relating to women's work standards and all of that the trade unions are not willing to do. You spoke about the verbal abuse and all of that sexual harassment that happens. The trade unions don't take up those particular issues. So we keep coming back to the issue about what is the point of keep saying, why can't we have this? Why can't we have this? But how are we going to convert an economic problem into something that requires a political solution?
No, I agree. But first, I think we need to, in what I wanted to place today is that we need to change the terms in which we are discussing the economic question. Then we talk about how to bring it about. And I agree with all of you. I agree with Padmini that there is the question of implementing it. Obviously, our government is not interested in implementing any such things. They would rather have wages be as low as possible in order to what they think of as attracting more investment, forgetting that actually it's not just simple wages, but the cost of unit production that's important. And productivity of labor comes in as a big factor in the cost. I mean, China's wages are many times India's wages, but they still are a lower cost producer because they're much more efficient management, much better equipped labor, and much better technological capability as a whole. So that is where we need to go, not think of lower wages. But I agree with you. Finally, we also need to be able to work out ways of implementation. But at this point, what I'm talking about is how to change the terms of the debate on what we should implement.
So if there is no more questions, so it's around almost it's exactly 5 o'clock. So maybe we can close this very engaging discussion, not only on garment, but it covers most of the other sectors as well. These issues, especially the social cost, the environmental issue that concerns the industry as well, which most of them don't discuss generally. So I thank all the participants, all the speakers, Professor Devanathan, Professor Padmini Swaminathan, Professor Sumangala, and Dr. Satyaki Roy. Thank you for this very engaging discussion. You all gained much from this. Okay. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thanks to everybody.
Thank you, Dev.
Thanks, Padmini and Satyaki.
Thank you. Thank you, Sumangala. Bye, Satyaki.
It's good to
Bye,
see all of
Rajesh.
you over here. Okay.
Okay.
Bye.
Thank you.